Now my job is supposed to build up the speaker, introduce him, telling you how good he is, how marvellous he is, how much good work he's done. But with our next speaker, I am redundant. All I need to say is our next speaker is Professor Kevin MacDonald.
Between being here in this beautiful room, I want to thank all the organizers because really did a great job. I want to talk about my sort of area, psychological mechanisms. I've written a lot about the Jews, and this is sort of tangentially related. Certainly we'll talk about that a little bit, but mainly this is about us. You know, what is it about us that's sort of allowing this to happen to us? I'm concerned, you know, obviously, whatever you want to say about the Jews, we're doing this to some extent to ourselves. We're allowing it to happen. It's happening only in European countries. So obviously, one mechanism is that the moral high ground, the intellectual high ground in the contemporary West is dominated by these hostile elites. That was the topic really in my book, the culture of critique. And at this point, they are able to punish anybody who gets out of line. So if a politician, business person, someone in the media says something that is controversial about Jews or about blacks in America or whatever, they're going to lose their job. So oftentimes the short-term interest of whites is simply to go along with this. I mean, if you want a good career, if you want a good life, if you want to make money, if you want to be in the media or even a major corporation, you can't say things that violate these strictures. And so we see a lot of public displays of white guilt and positive attitudes towards immigration. Right now we've got Jeb Bush in the U.S., very pro-immigration. He's talking about how Hispanic he is and everything. It's very important for career advancement. In short, the war on whites is massively incentivized. That is, there's very good salaries, positions, influence, and so on by going along with this system. Also, social learning. I'm a psychologist. Social learning is a very sort of basic mechanism in psychology. But the point is that models are more effective if they have prestige and high status. And that, of course, fits well with evolutionary theory because from an evolutionary point of view, we're supposed to, a tendency to look up to people who are dominant, people who are influential, and so on. So propaganda is much more effective if it's coming from institutions and high-level institutions of the society than it would be from just anybody down the street or something like that. So the very important issue is that the very top-level academic and media institutions are seen as okay, as presenting basically valid, true information and so on. That is critically important. We sort of believe, the sort of high level, in England, I suppose the BBC would be an example. People, basically accept what they're saying about the world. Oftentimes if you read these newspapers, you'll see quoted, prominent Harvard professors or other professors in America. I'm sure here we have Oxford and Cambridge and other professors. And the fact is that this high level massive immigration is a consensus value among elites. And if you oppose it, you've got a sort of moral problem, intellectual problem, you're not educated, there's something wrong with you. And that is coming from the highest institutions of society, from the best universities, the best media institutions, and so on. Once this new value set was institutionalized, it became the focus of status competition. So in the university, people compete like crazy to be the most politically correct, the most leftist. It happens all the time. And once an organization becomes dominated by a particular intellectual perspective, it's sort of hard to get out of that. Right now, pretty much the entire social sciences are dominated by what we call cultural Marxism, the sort of leftist attitudes. Race does not exist, and white people are the cancer of history, and so on. So if you are an aspiring academic, that's what your career that you aspire to, you are going to be subjected to a very high level of indoctrination in undergraduate and graduate studies by professors who have high prestige, who are smart people, and they're going to be telling you this, and really starts in kindergarten at a different level, but it goes straight to the university. These people, these institutions, these ideas they represent are seen as legitimate, as moral, and as the way to go. So there's, in fact, tremendous psychological pressure to adopt the fundamental intellectual assumptions at the heart of the discipline. As I say right now, within the social sciences, you probably can't find people anymore in most social sciences that will say that that race exists, that whites really are a biological entity, and so on. Once such a movement attains intellectual status, people are attracted to it because it's prestigeful. If you want to get a job, in a high-level academic institution, that's the way you have to go. On the other hand, if you're conservative, you're probably not going to get into graduate school You're going to be turned off by these ideas. You're going to fall by the wayside. You're not going to want to get into this. And why would you want to get into a profession where you're going to be seen as morally defective? And believe me, you won't get into the profession because they will keep you out. And when you have a hiring committee in universities, they will definitely look for those kinds of things and keep you out. But because the reality is that people who dissent from all this are shunned. I mean, it's happened to me for about 6 or 7 years at my university. Ostracized, people won't speak to you. They send you nasty emails on how evil you are. If I didn't have tenure, it would have been denied. But the big story is grants and promotions. All these things are going to be denied to you. So why would you want to be an academic under those circumstances? So the people who go into the field are already converted. And that's the point of I thought I had a citation there. Yeah, this Fossey and Gross paper. A very, very interesting paper about why conservatives are kept out of the academic world. The other mechanisms, I think those mechanisms are obvious, but I want to talk about individualism as an important mechanism for understanding us in particular. Going back to Fritz Lenz, he was a German biologist in the 1920s and 1930s, emphasized evolution in the North during the Ice Ages, and he had the idea that people in the North had less between-group competition. It was more about basically dealing with a very difficult, adverse environment. The ecology was very sparse, obviously. It did not support a clan type, large group competition kind of thing. And so you had natural selection for intelligence, because it's a very difficult environment, and inventiveness. But he also talked about a tendency to social isolation, not as sort of socially connected. But the idea is that individualism is part of Western uniqueness, widely seen that way. This is an illustration from an academic paper. Really, part A is what's important here. The parts colored in yellow are the more individualistic. You see it's Northwest Europe, Australia, the United States, and so on are the most individualistic. But pretty much all of Europe is. And so when we talk about it, sort of emphasize Northern Europe. But the fact is we are all closely related. All of us Europeans are closely related. But some of these tendencies, I think, are stronger in the North. This is another little illustration. This is patents. Patents tend to be correlated with the extent of individualism. People are more creative. They're trying new things, new ideas. So these individualistic societies have been very productive in terms of new ideas and all that. So a tendency to go along with patents. Also, in the North, Fritz Lenz would have emphasized this kind of thing. You have natural selection for pair bonding, for close family relationships, high investment in children. Because think about it, if you're out there in the Ice Ages and you don't want to support your children, what's going to happen to your children, obviously? They're not going to survive. In other words, you have to have males who are committed to the family, who are committed to supporting children. You have a tendency towards monogamy because, again, you can't support 3 or 4 wives in a very difficult, adverse environment. Whereas with collectivist societies, we tend to see people having more than one wife, and we also tend to see that the marriage is arranged rather than voluntary. So in the West, we see exogamous marriage. That means you're not married to kinship, people in your kin, based on individual choice, personal attraction rather than kinship. Kinship is de-emphasized in the North. It's less important because, again, it's sort of a battle with the environment. It's not a group competition sort of thing. You see the evolution. Again, you see this in all humans. But there's more of a tendency for love to be the basis of personal attraction in marriage in the West. Much written on. And in the North especially, you had selection for a lot of different hair colors, different eye colors, and so on, which became sort of markers of personal attraction. There's far more eye color and hair color diversity in Europe, particularly Northwest Europe. So Europeans are less ethnocentric, and that's obviously a problem for us. If we were more ethnocentric, it's much easier for us to erect borders. Europeans are less selected for between-group competition, less involved in extended kinship networks, clan-type societies. It's a basic family, mom, dad, and the kids, rather than an extended group of cousins and so on. For collectivist societies, we see a lot of that in England from what I've been reading. Pakistanis retain their sort of practices and traditions when they come to England. They have extended families, they'll have polygyny, they'll have very low status for their wives. Kinship is bilateral, it's on both sides, higher status for women, typical of Western Europe throughout history. The consensus nowadays is that there are basically 3 big population genetic events. in Western Europe. First of all, you have these Western hunter-gatherers that have been here forever, more than 8,000 years ago. And they tend to be, within that group, the ones that are more in the north, they've evolved the blonde hair and blue eyes. They can actually do they can exhume these bodies now and look at the genes, and they find that those genes, they had those genes way back when, around 7,000 years ago, you had a lot of farmers coming in from the Middle East. They had white skin. They were most influential in the south. But it spread in the southern part of Europe at that time. Quite a few of the hunter-gatherers actually had darker skin. And then the most recent one, about 4,500 years ago, were the Indo-Europeans. All of our languages are Indo-European. And they come from the Pontic steppes, so-called in present-day Ukraine, above the Caspian, the Black Sea area there. So three big population events. And I think within Europe, there are some differences resulting from that. Subtle differences, but important in the long run. So this is a recent population genetic illustration. And in this figure here, as you get into a darker blue, that means more hunter-gatherer genes. More of the genes of the people that were there originally, more than 8,000 years ago. Here you have tendency for having more of the farmer-type genes. And of course, that gets really dense as you go towards the Middle East. They have more connection to the Middle East. So what I want to look at is what are these hunter-gatherer groups like? And the idea is that hunter-gatherer groups are relatively egalitarian. That is, there's a lot of field work in anthropology looking at hunter-gatherer groups, and if one person tries to be a despot, it just doesn't work. People like that are removed. Authoritarian leadership does not fly. And so what we have is what we call egalitarian individualism. No one can rise above the others. And this is based on the work of Christopher Bain, anthropologist at USC. The paradigm really, I think, is the north. Again, these tendencies throughout Europe are more common in the north. And I think, what I'm trying to get at here is a theory of political correctness. And I think when you look at Northern Europe, you see more of this sort of intense political correctness than you do elsewhere. That's the basic idea. So one of the things that always impressed me here was these so-called Jante laws, where they're profoundly egalitarian. And I talk to people who are Swedish or familiar with Scandinavian culture, and they're quite familiar with this. That is, you sort of can't stand out from the crowd. You don't think you're anything, don't you think you're good, you're smarter than us, don't fancy you better, and so on. Very strong egalitarian tendency. People who try to get above others get pushed down. But there is a strong sense of individualism. Personal goals are paramount. Socialization emphasizes self-reliance. Rather, things like finding yourself, the hippies in the 1960s. More positive attitudes towards strangers, less ethnocentric. Again, we're saying that Europeans tend to be less ethnocentric than other people. More likely to behave in a pro-social, altruistic manner to strangers, like white medical missionaries to Africa. I actually had two aunts who died in India back in the 1930s. As medical missionaries to Africa. And of course now we see things like adopting Haitian babies at all the rage, or African babies and so on. But the tendency to behave in a more pro-social, altruistic manner to people who are unlike themselves. And if you look at some of the older racial science, have been doing that a little bit, very interesting. In the 19th century, they saw that the sort of moral idealism, or just idealism, as an ethnic trait of especially in the far north. The idea is that you create these universalistic moral ideas, and then you take steps to achieve those visions. So, for example, in the 19th century America, you had all these utopian communities. They would be set up to a certain plan. You would have a certain ideal up there, tend to be based on some view of human nature, moral ideal. And then you would try to do it in the real world. So they set them up on several places in America. It's quite common. Morality is defined not what is good for the individual or the group. It's an abstract moral ideal. One aspect of individualism is abstract moral ideas become more important than self-interest, and certainly groups. Groups don't have any status in that sort of philosophical theory of morality. Kant's famous imperative, act only according to the maxim, whereby you can at the same time that it should become a universal law. Moral universalism is a very strong trait in Western societies going back centuries. It's really about building a consensus and being able to control in an individualistic society where kinship relations are weak. You have to have the idea that if you're not going to build a society and a cohesive group on the basis of kinship, what are you going to base it on? And the idea is that Western societies have quite often based it on a sense of moral correctness. Individualism applies an equality of interest, everyone has the same interest, so the idea is that we create a morally defined in-group. A morally defined in-group, not defined by ethnicity, not defined by kinship. So what becomes important then is shame and guilt. Guilt is often, we assume that all these emotions are everywhere. A lot of people, Peter Frost, for example, in anthropology, guilt is far more common in Western Europe than anywhere else in the world. It seems to be unique to Western Europe. It's an internal motivation. Doing something because, it's not that somebody else even knows about it, but you are feeling guilty for violating this stricture. All the intellectual movements in the book, The Culture of Critique, were essentially moral indictments of the West. What I think these intellectuals understood was that moral critiques are the key to sort of unwinding the whole thing. Arguments on morality, therefore, seek this abstract, universal sense of morality. You can't say, well, it's good for white people, or it's good for whatever. Those kinds of arguments don't work. The universal arguments, independent of the interests of any individual, whereas collective societies aren't like that at all. There's an old Arab proverb, I guess my brother gets my cousin, and so on. And famously, is it good for the Jews? I mean, in other words, they don't have abstract principles. I think Mark was talking today, over in Israel, you have a strong sense this is a Jewish country. Over in America, they don't have that idea because their interests are different. They don't have a sense that we have to have a universal moral law and try to obey. You don't even give lip service to it. You have the idea that laws can be, should simply reflect your self-interest. So they, go full moral. In America, saying, you got to do this for universalistic moralistic reasons, but they completely reject that universalistic morality in Israel in their ethnic state. So in these groups, again, you're trying to think of how do you create a cohesive group of individualists. Well, what you want to do is pick people who have good reputation, people who are honest, people who are willing to accept the moral values of the group. That's the critical thing. Collective societies, on the other hand, is all about family ties. How closely related are you to that person? In Western groups, it's much more a sense of who, is this person honest? Can we trust that person? We're going to look and see, look at their history and try to scope them out. But the idea is to find, to show whether they are, in fact, an upstanding person that we want in our group. So the criteria for being in a group is not your race, is not anything except, are you a good person? Are you willing to uphold the moral norms of the society? The result is that individualistic societies, and particularly in Northwest Europe, have high levels of public trust, a strong sense that you can trust people, low levels of corruption. Whereas in the developing world, famously throughout Africa and Asia, corruption is a much bigger problem. Strong emphasis on conforming to group norms. I'm on Derek Turner. Yeah, Derek Turner's Twitter feed, right? And just the other day, he sent a tweet saying he's reading a book on Puritans from the 17th century, something like that. And he said, it looks very much like political correctness. And I said, right, yeah. Exactly. I mean, there's a long history here. This is not something that just happened in the 20th, 21st century. A strong emphasis on group norms. And you think about those groups, those Puritan groups, stifling conformity. We talk about them being individualistic, but that's not really the whole story. Because within those groups, they had to conform very much to this moral code. If you were to ignore that, you would ruin your reputation, you would be shunned, you'd be thrown out in the street. And what happens, it's interesting what happens when these moral codes break down. What you see is the outbreak of extreme individualism. And so in America, to go back to the 19th century, you have these what we call libertarian anarchists, and it's an offshoot of the Puritans. In a way, it's the opposite of the Puritans, right? These people don't believe in any kind of constraints on individual behavior, whatever makes you feel good, free love and all that. In other words, once you get out of these stifling moral communities that I think are paradigmatic here, all kinds of sort of libertarianism, very very big in America. You see, read something, I don't know as much about England, but in America, libertarianism is very respectable. Ron Paul, famously, politician, but opposing drug laws, opposing race-based affirmative action, because you shouldn't use a group designation when you make these decisions. Tending to favor open borders, because how can you discriminate against anyone? They don't have any sense of race. It's totally individualistic, no constraints on individual behavior. In the 1920s and 1960s, there's a strong tendency in the West for sort of libertarian anarchy when these moral constraints break down. And to some extent, we've certainly seen that now. The other idea is implicit whiteness. The idea that whites tend to cohere together. Just talking with someone, talking about these very liberal people in the UK and they're very pro-immigration and all that, they don't live near any of this stuff. Yeah. Right. They don't live near it. So they avoid it, but they are living a white life. That is, their neighbors are white. They take advantage of the safety of those neighborhoods and everything else. In America, there's a lot of examples of that. The so-called Tea Party movement recently was all white. It was almost just weird to see any non-white in it. The stock car racing is a huge sport, and it's all white guys and their girlfriends. Whites fleeing these diverse areas. Everybody knows about white flight in America. I mean, the suburbs used to be white. St. Louis is a good example. Ferguson's all over the news. Well, Ferguson just a few years ago, with the vast majority, was white. And now it's very, very much black. And now so you have all this crime and everything else. So what I want to talk about here is the fact that in a way, culture really is very, very important. I want to talk about cortical control of the feelings and subcortical feelings. So talk about the cortex, the top part of your brain, responsible for thinking and language and all that kind of conscious stuff, whereas the subcortex is your sort of animal part of your brain, is not conscious. What's going on is that the media has these explicit messages. The media, I think I have a picture here. So the media has these messages, and they go to your cortex, and you process them linguistically and so on. And our brain then has the ability to inhibit the impulses from the lower part of our brain. So if we're constantly told that being pro-white is bad or something like that, the media, creation of a moral, essentially what the media is doing is creating a moral community, like the Puritans did, but on a very large scale now. But they're putting out messages, and then they're basically what happens is that people inhibit their sort of natural attitudes. So in the limbic system, the subcortical part of the brain, you have pro-white attitudes. You have attraction to people who look like you. Phil Rushton's very important work on people attracted to those who look like that. He did anthropological measurements and so on. People are xenophobic to some extent. Again, white people tend to be less xenophobic than anybody else in the world, but there is some. And so what happens is these tendencies are trying to get out, but the cortex is able, we now know how the cortex works, how it's able to inhibit tendencies coming from the lower part of our brain, and that's essentially what is going on with the media these days. So the fight over essentially what this is a fight over control of the cortex. We're trying to control, because of the power of the cerebral cortex, it's a vital prize, you might say, in this evolution. So my book really is about really saying that evolution is now being fought out in the realm of ideas. We're fighting for control of people's brains, basically. And media messages, when you go to a class in university and so on. These intellectual movements of the left, particularly the moral imperative, immigration and so on, the decline in evolutionary thinking in the social sciences, the general loss of cultural confidence in the West have been major components of this unfolding disaster. In other words, the war has been fought really for your brain, and that's why the colleges are so intent on indoctrinating students about all these issues. So I want to talk about some historical examples. We mentioned the Puritans, but what I'm trying to say is that these tendencies go back a long way in English history, British history. The Puritans were based in East Anglia. Towards the channel there. Originally, though, from Denmark. I think that's important. It's a Scandinavian group originally. And there's a strong tendency to pursue these utopian causes framed as moral issues. That is, some kind of moral issue. They were the ones who were very concerned about slavery in America. They're the sort of force behind the abolitionist movement in America. And as I mentioned before, you had all these model communities, utopian communities in 19th century America. Essentially, you'd have a moral ideal, and then you would try to produce it. And they were also willing to bear great costs in order to impose moral perfection. What we call, it's actually in the evolutionary literature, they call altruistic punishment. That's where you punish someone, but you incur a cost to do so. Because you punish a cheater or somebody who's bad, even if it costs you a lot. So moralistic aggression, very typical of the Puritans, and this morally defined in-group. These, as I said, were the people who led the movement in America to abolish slavery. And very strong controls within the group to enforce morality, but what you might call a 17th century version of political correctness. So again, this is the model here that you have, the cortex, where you have this ideal. All people are the same, slavery is moral evil, and so on. And on the other hand, in the limbic system, you might have self-interest of various kinds. The idea is that the cortex is able to dominate these limbic tendencies and is able to make people crusade for these moral ideals. And this of course, is way before they have Jewish influence. Another book that illustrates this is David Hackett Fisher's book. He compared New Zealand with the United States. In the United States, in the 18th century, we had a revolution, right? And he argues that England was treating the U.S. pretty badly at that time. There was a lot of resentment, a lot of problem. Whereas a very different situation in New Zealand. New Zealand was settled around the 1840s. Greater emphasis on social justice and fairness. He gives a lot of examples. I just picked a couple. But colonial administrators, like Hobson here, a leader of the high probity, recruited able and honorable men to serve in the colony, concerned about justice and fairness, self-consciously trying to uphold a universalist morality. This is in the middle of the 19th century. And then another quote here, already in the 19th century, a strong sense of high-mindedness, crusading moral universalism. Bishop George Augustus Selwyn became Anglican Bishop of New Zealand, a high-principled idealist with a broad ecumenical version of Christianity, which in New Zealand became linked to the ideal of racial equality between them and the native Maoris. Another example, Andrew Joyce. If you really should look at Andrew Joyce's work. He's posted a lot in Occidental Observer and a lot in Occidental Quarterly. He's a PhD historian writing under an assumed name. And he did an article in Occidental Quarterly on the rebellion in Morant Bay in Jamaica in 1861. This was a case, this is after slavery had been abolished, but you have a rebellion of the blacks against the whites, and there was a lot of slaughter and rape. It was just horrible. He says the clear-thinking individual was plainly criminal. An unimaginably brutal series of actions carried out for malicious reasons against a population targeted for being white. And yet, there was a liberal faction in England, convinced that it was not only the black population that were the true victims, but also that their fellow whites were reprehensible monsters who deserved the fate which befell them. This pathological response, laden with a misplaced hyper-emotionality, would shake the empire to the core, sapping its confidence and bequeathing a legacy which is still felt to this day. The main warriors on behalf of the blacks were Christian philanthropists who believed that the races should be raised to standards of education that would place them right alongside Europeans. Racial equality was a big part of that whole idea. Members of the in-group tended to be nonconformist, middle class, liberal in their politics, or radical. Most had never lived outside Britain. You know, it's one of our examples again, where these liberals have all these ideas, but they don't really live the life, and they can basically escape the problems. They have little or no experience with the races that they so persistently eulogize. The other thing I've done research on is the movement to end slavery in England in the 18th, towards the end of the 18th century and into the 19th century. Here, really all these different nonconformist groups were involved, the Quakers, the Methodists, the Puritans, and so on. But even the Church of England, as time went on, signed on to this. The Quakers were central. They were leaders of the group, and I'd like to focus a little bit on them. There's a paradigmatic of this Western tendency towards universalism, sort of moral righteousness. They were of critical importance really at all stages, the foremost champion of liberty. They did the vast majority of the day-to-day work, trying to spread the word and so on. Their religious ideology is what we call the apotheosis of moral universalism. In other words, self-interest has no moral standing at all. The basic belief that God's inner light shone equally on all human beings of all races. Anthony Benezet was an American Quaker from England. Human equality was an ontological fact. And I think a lot of people believe that now. It's not something you can question. It's just sort of part of the universe. And that's sort of the way it is. It's an ontological fact and a philosophical doctrine. He said his interest in the welfare of Native Americans and the poor. Statement by the Quaker Committee was titled, "The Case of Our Fellow Creatures, the Oppressed Africans." Those fellow creatures. They're not seen as an outgroup. They're seen as just like everybody else. This is moral universalism. The Quakers themselves were highly egalitarian. That's what I want to emphasize. There's a strong egalitarian bent here in these movements. They were democratic. There were no bishops. There were ordained ministers. Women could speak. And as with the hunter-gatherer groups, there was a consensus kind of thing. You didn't have a despot leading these groups. They were economically successful, but they formed a group apart, like the Puritans. The Puritans came to Massachusetts because they wanted to have their own place. Nobody else could be around. And then they tried to do that for a while, but the government of England prevented them from doing it. So they thought of themselves a holy nation, as Jews do. So they saw that they wanted England to be a moral group. The whole nation should be committed to this sense of morality. Again, not kinship or race. They had no concept of that. All people are brothers and so on. But you had a strong sense. Dissenters were shunned. Dissenters were ostracized. As I say, that sound familiar? I mean, in other words, this is what we see now, over and over again, where people who dissent from these moral imperatives of racial equality or immigration, they are shunned and ostracized. They had a very watchful guard. This is also true of the Puritans and these other groups. All miscreants are going to be brought to account. Did a member neglect to attend the means of grace? He was guilty of disorderly walking. Every little bit of life was scrutinized. And the Puritans, of course, were very much like. That's what I say. It's an early version of political correctness. The hunter-gatherer ethic implies that one's moral character becomes the most important aspect of in-group status. You attain your position and keep your position by subscribing to the moral norms. Fundamentally, the movement to end slavery operated by defining abolitionism as a moral in-group psychologically analogous to a hunter-gatherer band. Those who continued to advocate the slave trade and slavery were shunned. They were seen as morally, just complete moral miscreants, pariahs. The logic basically is that we all groups live in a dangerous world. You have to have some way of holding it together. And the idea is, rather than based on known kinship groups, the prototypical egalitarian individualist groups of Northwest Europe are based on reputation and trust. In other words, your honesty, your willingness to accept moral norms. Like the Puritans, the Quakers stem from a distinctive, ethnically based British subculture originating in Scandinavia. The predominant region was the North Midlands, colonized by Viking invaders, prized individual ownership of houses. They spoke Norse into the 12th century. They're very, very much Scandinavian. This is a classic. This guy here, just try to imagine this guy's brain. John Woolman, the quintessential Quaker, 18th century. He opposed slavery, lived humbly, and felt guilty about preferring his own children to children on the other side of the world. That's the kind of problem. That this is very mainstream thought in the history of this country, and in America you see it as well. Quakers then created a moral in-group. Those outside were seen as immoral, and doing that is going to light up their brain circuits for pleasure. They're going to feel good doing that kind of stuff. That's the way the brain works. And similar tendencies can be found in other groups. I think these are more extreme. But the Methodists were also big time involved in the anti-slavery movement. The Anglicans came on board after a while. And especially the descendants of the Puritans, who sensed some moral idealism was a critical force for ending slavery in the United States. They were the big leaders in the United States. The Quakers certainly supported that, but they weren't as powerful and influential as the Puritans. So they framed these African slaves as members of the common humanity, the universal moral in-group rather than a racial out-group. Here's an example of very influential leading line of the evangelical Anglicans. The point of opposition to slavery was to gain to society, through reason, through religion, half of our kind, 500,000 of our kind, equally with us adapted for advancing themselves in every art and science that can distinguish man from man, equally with us capable of looking forward to and enjoying futurity. In other words, this is a statement of racial equality in the late 18th century, very clearly stated. They're just the same as us. They can become whatever their opportunities allow them. A big part of it, though, was empathy, trying to get the empathy of people. And so when they had hearings in Parliament, they showed this illustration of a slave ship. And the point was how they were packed in, how horrible that was. And that they were showing that this was a very, if you think about the media in the 18th century, it wasn't like it is now, but it existed, and this was reproduced thousands and thousands of times. And this medallion, very famous medallion, again from the 18th century, it says, "I'm a man and a brother." In other words, you are just like me, you're my brother, about someone who's in a different race and so on. Whatsoever you would that men do to you, so this is the golden rule. Again, moral universalism is very characteristic of Western societies. So the conclusion I'm just going to is that Western uniqueness results from really two powerful currents. The hunter-gatherer culture that I think was indigenous to Europe, especially Northern Europe, persisting through the Ice Ages. If you think about it, giving up this land that people controlled for 10, 15,000 years is mind-boggling. What we call egalitarian individualism, a strong tendency towards egalitarianism, exogamy, not marrying relatives, representative, non-despotic political culture based on consensus. moral conformity and reputation is basic, and policing the morals of the group. Now, of course, it's opposition to racism, pro-white sentiments and so on are seen as just a mark of just absolute evil. The other thing I'm not going to be talking about today is what we call egalitarian, this sort of, where it's more the resulting from these military elites, stemming more from the Indo-European invaders. We talked about the other great population event in European history. These are the people that gave us our languages and so on. But it's much more hierarchical, much more military-oriented. It's an offshoot. What happened over there in the Pontic steppe is that they managed to domesticate cattle and make cheese. They had a gene, or they evolved a gene eventually that could so they could drink milk and eat cheese and so on. And that produced that was a huge advantage for them. They spread all over. They came through Europe, they went down to India, over to Iran, even close to China. Very, very hierarchical in relations to dominance and subordination. European pre-modern military elites. The planters in the South would characterize it basically that. I'm not going to go into detail about that now. But the point is that egalitarian individualism has consistently won out over aristocratic individualism in Western history since the English Civil War. The American Civil War, of course, was an example where the egalitarian individualists of the North, the Puritan-based group, versus the aristocratic individualists of the South, far more aristocratic. In America, the Puritan tradition dominated culturally until the rise of the Jewish-dominated movements in the 20th century. In the 19th century, transcendentalism and other, really, if you look at the intellectual elite, it came from the Puritans, centered in the Ivy League universities. The Puritans were very big on education. As soon as they came to America, for a few years, they established Harvard, and then Yale, and all those big universities out there. They dominated this country intellectually, really until you had the rise of these Jewish groups that I talked about in Cultural Critique. There was a period of defense. Some of these people, like Madison Grant, and Stoddard, but that collapsed, in my opinion, at least by 1965, with the rise of Jews as a hostile elite in America and throughout the West. And the reason, the West had this relatively less ethnocentric, and they were very permeable, as we say. They didn't have strong barriers between themselves and others. Very prone to moral universalism. If they couldn't reason in a way that say, well, we were here first, and we instituted Harvard. We're going to keep you guys out. They did that. They tried that for a while, but it collapsed. So, essentially, all the movements that I talked about in Cultural Critique are moral indictments of the West. I think having a moral indictment is critical to any political intellectual movement in the West. We really need that. I think white people need to have a sense that they're morally justified. And now, of course, it's based on the past of slavery, colonialism, anti-Semitism, the history of anti-Semitism, exclusion of Jews from the Protestant elite. Just today, the National Observer, I got this piece that actually relates to Steve Saylor's article on a Jewish producer in Hollywood. And his formative years were in high school, where he just hated the fact that Jews couldn't be in a certain country club in Los Angeles. And Saylor closes it by saying, and so therefore I go to work every day and get revenge. And it's a sense of revenge against these people who excluded our people. So the general disbanding of the West, as a result of it, is going to occur in a moral context, and that's what we're seeing now. So the suggestion, obviously, is to defend the moral legitimacy of our interests, of the traditional peoples and cultures of the West. In the face of it, it's outrageous to allow a continent like this that's been dominated by certain people for at least 10,000 years, and since the glaciers went back, around 15,000 years ago, to just give that up in a couple of generations. But we should emphasize the cost of multiculturalism, the conflict, the ethnic conflict, social conflict, the fact that people get disengaged, they don't care about their communities as much. Lack of willingness to contribute to public goods. People don't want to contribute to public health care if they're not going to benefit. And that's what was a big problem in America, passing socialized health care. Everybody knew, well, if you pass it, who's going to be first in line? Blacks and Latinos and so on. All the socialized programs in Europe happened when Europe was white. We have to create our own moral in-groups and shun those who disagree. Basically, it's the same way they did. Thank you.
That's all we have time for now. We have the moral right on our side, and we truly do have the best minds on our side. Kevin MacDonald!